These days, the term socialism often gets a bad rap from the people it would benefit the most, i.e., the working class. And when you look at how the argument has been framed in the mainstream media and intelligentsia, you can see why. On one side, you have the revolt of the ugly, representing socialism. They hate tradition, aesthetic beauty, masculinity, any form of discipline or authority. And on the other hand, the people who are told they should fight off these socialists and defend capitalism are largely working class people who appreciate structure, family, and many of the things the self-proclaimed socialists rebel against. But the grand irony of it all is the socialism the working class people are told to hate is exactly the economic method that would benefit them the most. Meanwhile, the big capitalists that the left pretends to rebel against are in reality their sugar daddies, their most enthusiastic supporters. So how is this? Everyone from big media, big tech, big business, big banks, all the results of the capitalist method are all in lockstep support through finance, organizing, and propaganda of the so-called socialists. How did this come about? Why are the people who would benefit most from socialism so adverse to it? And why are the people who are the furthest from being actual socialists deemed, in their own mind and by mainstream intelligentsia, the defenders of socialism? It is because in the modern discussion, socialism is represented by Marxism, not actual socialism. It is because of this that the left has become the revolt of the ugly, because that's what Marxism demands of a people. Traditions, families, authority, gender roles, aesthetic beauty in art, architecture, or people were all bourgeois, thus needing to be destroyed. Never mind the fact, every country that became the result of communist revolutions immediately and directly contradicted Marxism by not destroying or attacking, but rather rejuvenating things like folk art, nuclear families, strong nationalist tendencies, aristocracy within the military, aesthetic beauty, and so on. Every victorious communist, from Stalin to Tito to Mao to Castro, all realized Marxism was not an actual political philosophy. Marxism was a critique and a method of destruction. Nothing more. Nothing that could be applied to actual life, to actual politics. In a sense, Marxism is very liberal, thus attracting liberals and not actual socialists. As we see today, Marx preached constant crisis and destruction and had no concept of building, much like the liberals being an ideology of constant critique. This is why no communist revolution could ever end with someone actually following Marxism. To do so would be constant tearing down of oneself and surrounding, masochism for the sake of masochism. Socialism is about building up, not tearing down, about giving to get, and most of all, about unity, not division. In the early 2000s, many of the leftists, despite as comical as it might have been with the drum circles and the Starbucks lattes, much of their attention was focused on the financial elite. Those in their ivory towers figured out quick it was time to hyperinflate the tension with the darker-skinned plebs and the lighter-skinned plebs, so we could beat each other in the heads with broomsticks as they looked down upon us from their ivory towers. And it has worked to their advantage. Now, specifically, working class and lower class people are at each other's throats, while the rich and powerful remain rich and gain more power, thus leaving the people with less power. And this is why these quote-unquote socialists on the left are nothing but identity politics, pure liberalism, nothing to do with actual socialism. The only way to change that reality is to have a true populist pushback, and a part of that is understanding Marxism is not socialism. And socialism is an economic philosophy that not only predates the modern age, but is in fact an economic system that works for the people rather than, as we have today, an economic system that the people work for. To go more in depth on the topic of socialism, we will look at Oswald Spengler's essay, Prussian Socialism. We pick up with Spengler expanding on the difference of the origins and promotion of socialism by his interpretation of a fundamental split in Western man during and after the era of Viking settlements in places like modern England and France. The organized colonization of the Slavic frontier involved Germans of all tribes, but the area was ruled by nobles from Lower Saxony. Thus, the Prussian people, by origin, is closely related to the English. It was the same Saxons, Frisians, and Angles who, as roving Viking bands, and often under Norman and Danish names, subdued the Celtic Britons. Saxon settlements sprang up along the Thames, just as they had in the desert-like region near the Havel and Spree rivers, a stretch of land comparable to the desolate expanse and fateful importance only to Latium and the Roman Campania. But the Viking spirit and the communal spirit of the Teutonic Knights gradually gave rise to two antithetical ethical imperatives. One side bore the Germanic idea actively within itself, while the other felt itself subject to it. Personal independence on one hand, and supra-personal community spirit on the other. Today we refer to these concepts as individualism and socialism. Virtues of the most exalted kind are summarized by these words. In the one case, personal responsibility, self-reliance, determination, and initiative. And in the other, loyalty, discipline, selflessness, and a sense of obligation. To be free and to serve. There is nothing more difficult, that is. A people whose spirit and being are capable of it, a nation that can truly serve and be free, deserves to take upon itself a great destiny. In their splendid isolation, the English have achieved on the basis of their ethical instinct a unity both internal and external, such as no other modern Western European people has attained. England has produced a unique form of respectable society, a class of ladies and gentlemen, joined together by a strong sense of common interest and by uniform patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior. Now, stick with this series as laying the foundation for the argument to be made here. Since 1750, this magnificent type of society has been the model for all of modern civilization, and in France first of all. The artistic fashion known as empire served as a background for this style of living. It was essentially a practical and restrained form of Rococo, and it imbued this society's whole environment with elegant and refined taste. In this connection, we think today particularly of the masters of the civilized portrait, Gainsborough and Reynolds. The English were united by a common feeling of success and good fortune, unlike the Prussians, who were moved by a sense of challenge and duty. We may think of the English as Olympians of the business world at the banquet table, or as Vikings returned from distant explorations, but not as knights on the field of battle. Next to noble parentage, wealth is the major condition for acceptance in the group. It is also the criterion for rank within the group's social structure. Wealth is the Englishman's prime virtue, his distinguishing mark, his goal and his ideal. Today, only England has what may be called social culture, although it does not possess any other, more philosophical form of culture. The English are a people of profound superficiality. We Germans, in the land of poet and thinkers, so often display merely a superficial profundity. There is not and cannot be a German or Prussian type of society like the English. A society made up of separate egos, lacking the unifying pathos of a common purpose and goal, always strikes us as somewhat ridiculous. In imitation of the English club and banquet, our German individualists and liberals have invented the Verein and the Festessen. These are his devices for the development of cultural solidarity. And the Verein is translated into usually a social or political organization or association, and the Festessen is a communal banquet or feast. The Prussian style of living, in contrast to all this, has produced a profound and vigorous rank consciousness, a feeling of unity based on an ethos of work, not leisure. It unites the members of each professional group, military, civil service, and labor, by infusing them with a pride of vocation, and dedicates them to activity that benefits all others, the totality, the state. The bond of unity at all levels is a supreme ethos of dedication, not of success. The distinguishing feature of membership is rank, not wealth. The captain is superior to the lieutenant, even though the latter may be a prince or a millionaire. The French used the term bourgeoisie during their revolution to underscore the ideal of equality, but this corresponds neither to the English nor German sense of distance in social relations. A feeling for a distance is common in both Germanic peoples. We differ only in the origins of the feeling. When a German worker uses the word bourgeoisie, he means a person who, in his opinion, has merely obtained a certain social rank without performing any real work. It is the English ideal seen from the German perspective. England has its snobs, Germany its title seekers. The centuries-old feeling of group solidarity in both countries has brought forth a magnificent conformity of physical and mental attitudes. In the one case, a race of successful businessmen. In the other, a race of workers. One important symbol of this process, albeit an external one, is the English taste in men's clothing. England has produced civilian dress in the purest sense, the uniform of the private individual. Their fashion holds unopposed sway in all of Western Europe. England has clothed the world in its uniform, the symbol of free trade, private fortune-making. The counterpart of this English style is the Prussian uniform. It is the emblem of public service, not of private existence. Rather than symbolizing the success gained by diligent activity, it stands for that activity itself. "I am the first servant of my state," said the Prussian king, whose father had made the wearing of uniforms a customary practice amongst the nobility. How many have fully understood the significance of the phrase, "the king's mantle"? To the Prussian way of thinking, the will of the individual is subsumed under the will of the totality. The officers' corps, the members of the civil service branches, August Bebel's army of workers, and ultimately the German Volk of 1813, 1870, and 1914 have all felt, willed, and acted as a suprapersonal unity. This is not just herd instinct. It is an expression of sublime strength and freedom, something which the outsider can never understand. Prussianism is exclusive. Even in its proletarian form, it rejects the workers of other countries together with their egotistic pseudo-socialism. Servility, snobbishness, these are the words for attitudes that are understood and despised only when they degenerate. The genuine Prussian despises no one, but he is himself feared. The English, indeed the whole world, will never understand that the Prussian ethic carries with it a profound inner independence. For people of sufficient mental capacity, a system of social obligations guarantees a supreme freedom of the inner life, which is not possible under a system of social privileges. So you see, as he's setting the scene here, and he makes a distinction of social obligation guarantees a supreme freedom of the inner life, being a part of something, contributing something, gaining from that something, which is not possible under the system of social privileges. And that's what we live in America. And most of the West today is a system based off of social privileges. So the concept of this supreme inner freedom is missing on the people. They don't understand that when they see collectivism. They don't understand that when they see working socialism. Hence why many of the quote-unquote Marxists or socialists today are very individual and identity-based, and everything is legitimately about identity politics to them. It's social privilege politics is all they're concerned about. Nothing about the working and functioning of a society together to give back to the state and to get from the state. Nothing of that concept, which is primal when you get down to it. It's hunters and gatherers. It was the organic socialism that people created amongst themselves, amongst their tribes. So it's hard for people to wrap their mind around that concept because they're just concerned with, once again, the social privileges. The Englishman pays for his practical freedom with the loss of the other kind of freedom. He is inwardly a slave, whether a Puritan, a rationalist, a sensualist, or a materialist. For 2 centuries now, he has been the inventor of all philosophies that do away with inner independence. Most recently, he has produced Darwinism, which makes man's entire psychic makeup dependent on material forces. The Englishman belongs to his society in the spiritual sense as well. His clothing is also an expression of his uniformed conscience. He cherishes his right to act as a private citizen. Yet for him, there exists no such thing as private thinking. His life is governed by a unified, theological-orientated philosophy of little real content, as fashionable as frock coat and gloves. The term herd instinct is appropriate here, if anywhere. The Prussian socialist ethic maintains that the chief aim of life is not happiness. Do your duty, it says, by doing your work. The English capitalist ethic says, get rich, and then you won't have to work anymore. There is doubtless something provocative about this latter motto. It is tempting. It appeals to very basic human instincts. The working masses of ambitious nations have understood it well. As late as the 19th century, it produced the Yankee type with his irresistible practical optimism. The other motto is forbidding. It is for the few who wish to inject it into the community and thus force it upon the masses. The first maxim is for a stateless country, for egoists and Viking types with the urge for constant personal combat, such as we find in English sportsmanship. It implies extreme independence of mind, the right to gain happiness at the expense of all others, as long as one's strength holds out. In other words, scientific Darwinism. The other, however, is an expression of the socialist idea in all its profundity, the will to power, the struggle for happiness, but for the happiness of the totality, not of the individual. In this sense, Frederick Wilhelm I, and not Marx, was the first conscious socialist. The universal socialist movement had its start with this exemplary personality. In the final phase of Western European culture, 2 great schools of philosophy were founded. The English school of egoism and sensualism around 1700, and the Prussian school of idealism around 1800. They express what these nations are as ethical, religious, political, and economic entities. Among all the peoples of Western Europe, these 2 are distinguished by a rigid social hierarchy. This is a sign of their drive for dynamic activity. It puts every individual in the precise location in which he is needed most. Such an ordering is the result of a wholly unconscious and involuntary conservation of energy. It is natural and proper to a particular people only. No other people, no man of genius, or ever so powerful will can possibly recreate it. It is an expression of the people's fundamental moral and ethical attitude. Centuries are required for the clarification and the realization of this special feeling for social structure. The Viking spirit and the spirit of medieval knights are apparent here also. The ethos of success and the ethos of duty. The English people is structured along the lines of wealth and poverty. The Prussian along the lines of command and obedience. The meaning of class distinctions is thus completely different in these two countries. In an association of independent private citizens, the lowest class is the group that has nothing. In a true state, the lowest class is the group that has nothing to say. In England, democracy means the possibility that everyone can get rich. In Prussia, it means that the existing ranks are open to everyone. Within the structure of Prussian society, the individual receives his place according to his ability, not according to the demands of tradition. Here, finally, we can grasp the profound ethical meaning of the slogans capitalism and socialism. They represent two systems of social stratification, one that is based on wealth and the uninhibited struggle for success, and the other that is founded on authority and legislation. The Englishman would never accept commands from someone poorer than himself, nor would the Prussian ever pay homage to wealth for its own sake. Unequal distribution of wealth is the typical English proletarian formula used repeatedly by Shaw. Talking about George Bernard Shaw. Though it sounds ridiculous to us, it is precisely appropriate to the ideal of living professed by the civilized Viking. With due respect to the magnificent flowering of his ideal in the Yankee type, we might speak of two forms of socialism existing in the Anglo-Saxon world and in Germany. Socialism for the billionaires and socialism for the civil servants. As an example for the first type, we can point to Andrew Carnegie, who first transformed a large amount of public funds into a private fortune, only to turn around and distribute it with sovereign gesture among public enterprises. His pronouncement, "Whoever dies poor dies in dishonor," implies a high regard for the will to power over the totality. George Bernard Shaw is today the prime exponent of capitalistic socialism, which still sees wealth and poverty as the controlling factors in the economic sphere. Poverty is the greatest of evils and the worst of crimes. He preaches against the cowardly masses that cling to the feeble prejudice that it is better to be good than rich. The workers should try to get rich. This was the policy of the English trade unions right from the beginning. That is why there has never been a socialism in the proletarian sense in England from Owen to Shaw. It was impossible to distinguish from the capitalism of the lower class. For us, the controlling factor of society is the interplay of command and obedience in a strictly ordered community, be it state, party, officers' corps, or civil service. The member of any one of these communities is a servant of that community. Then he says, it's this French saying here, traveler pour l'idée de Prusse, excuse that butchery, but that means doing one's duty without giving oneself up to corrupt notions of private profit. The wages paid to Prussian officers and civil servants since the days of Frederick William I had been ridiculously small when compared to the sums required to belong even to the middle class in England. But the Prussians have worked harder, more selflessly, and more honestly. The real compensation for this work is rank. This workers' state within a state did not want to get rich. It wanted to rule. During their enforced strikes, these workers starved often enough, but in the interest of gaining power, not for higher wages. They struck in support of a philosophy that was supposedly or actually opposed to that of their employers. They struck for a moral principle, and a defeat in their battle could ultimately mean a moral victory. The same contrast prevails in the economic thought of both countries. Political economists have committed the fateful error of thinking solely in materialistic terms, instead of considering the multiplicity of economic insight in the world. They always speak in general terms of the economic stratification of man, of the modern age, and of the present. When using such language, the scientific discipline of political economies displays all the shortcomings of its English origins, for it had its start among modern Englishmen. With all their self-confidence and lack of psychological tact, it became their only philosophy. It corresponded to their sense of mercantile competition, success, and personal gain. With this purely English interpretation of economic affairs, they have infected the minds of the continent since the 18th century. The Teutonic Knights that settled and colonized the eastern borderlands of Germany in the Middle Ages had a genuine feeling for the authority of the state in economic matters, and later Prussians have inherited that feeling. The individual is informed of his economic obligations by destiny, by God, by the state, or by his own talent. These are simply different words for the same fact. Rights and privileges of producing and consuming goods are equally distributed. The aim is not ever greater wealth for the individual or for every individual, but rather the flourishing of the totality. Thus, Frederick William I and his successors colonized the marshlands in the East, regarding this as their divine mission. The modern German laborer, with his fine sense of reality, has thought and acted along precisely these lines, although the theories of Karl Marx have obscured for him the close connections between his own aims and those of the old Prussians. The pirate instinct of the insular nation has a wholly different understanding of economic affairs. Their economic activity is considered a matter of combat and booty, ultimately the individual's share in the booty. The Norman state, which developed a refined technique of amassing money reserves, was based entirely on the piracy principle. The feudal system was introduced as a magnificent and elegant means to that same piratical end. The barons exploited the land appointed to them and were in turn exploited by the duke. The goal of all was wealth. God bestowed it on the venturesome. The modern science of accounting had its start with these sedentary pirates. The words check, account, control, receipt, record, and the modern term for the English treasury, exchequer, originated in the accounting chambers of the Norman Duke Robert Lee de Bell, died 1035 AD. When England was conquered in 1066 AD, the Norman barons expropriated the Saxons, their tribal relatives, in the same way. Their descendants have inherited their outlook. The same style is still apparent today in every English trade company and every American trust. Their aim is not to work steadily to rise the entire nation's standard of living. It is rather to produce private fortunes by the use of private capital, to overcome private competition, and to exploit the public through the use of advertising, price wars, artificial stimulation of the consumer, and strict control of the ratio of supply and demand. When the Englishman speaks of national wealth, he means the number of millionaires in the country. As Frederick Engels wrote, nothing is more foreign to the English mentality than solidarity. Even in sports and recreation, the Englishman sees a test of personal, and especially physical, superiority. He engages in sports for the sake of national and world records. He enjoys prize fighting, a sport that is closely related to his economic habits and is quite alien to the minds of the gymnasts in Germany. All this proves that the economic existence of England is synonymous with business, i.e., a refined form of piracy. The English instinct regards all commodities as booty, items to be manipulated in order to get rich. The English machine industry was created in the interest of the commerce and trade, its chief aim being the production of cheap goods. When English agriculture began to limit wage cuts by fixing its own prices, it was simply abandoned in the interests of commerce. The battle between capital and labor in English industry in 1850 were concerned with the commodity labor. One side wanted to get it cheap, the other wanted a high price for it. Everything that Marx has to say with grudging admiration about capitalistic society refers primarily to English and not a universal economic instinct. The sublime term free trade is part and parcel of Viking economics. The Prussian, i.e. socialist term would be state control of the exchange of goods. This assigns to trade a subordinate rather than a dominant role within the complex of economic activity. We can understand why Adam Smith harbored a hatred of the state and the cunning beasts called statesmen. Indeed, government officials must have the same effect on tradesmen as police on burglars and naval cruisers on the crews of pirate ships. Likewise, characteristic of the Englishman is his overestimation of the importance of capital sums for economic health. The materialist finds it impossible to understand that the English concept of capital is psychologically and therefore practically, the practical life is, after all, the expression of the psychic conditions, different from the French system of private means and the Prussian concept of administrative funds. The English have never been good at psychology. They have always considered their own ideas as logically binding on mankind. In fact, all of the modern political economic rests on the basic error of equating economic life everywhere in the world with an exclusively English interest in business, and the error is committed even by those who reject the theories of the Manchester School. Marxism, in the very act of negating this theory, has adopted its patterns quite completely. This explains the grotesque fiasco of all predictions concerning the outbreak of the World War. It was said that the collapse of the world economy would follow within a few months. English-style capitalism is the only true counterpart to Marxist socialism. The regulation of economic affairs by the state, a Prussian idea, transformed German capitalism instinctively into a socialist economic pattern. The first step in this process was the protective tariff legislation of 1879. The large syndicates were, in effect, economic states within the state. They represent capitalism's first practical and systematic large-scale attempt, although it was not consciously planned, to understand the mysteries of its own techniques and to gain control of social forces which up to then had been regarded as natural and unfathomable, requiring passive or blind submission. Nevertheless, German liberalism, the Englishman within us, still worships free trade, not just the freedom of the human spirit. In doing so, the liberal German cuts his silliest figure, because he has misunderstood and tended to favor certain Viking instincts. He has summarily rejected the authoritarian state, the suprapersonal will, and the suppression of the individual in favor of the totality. By adopting this attitude, he has acted, or so he believes, metaphysically. That is the belief of educated Germans who lack practical experience. The professors, the poets and thinkers, all those who write profusely and never do anything. They cannot, of course, understand or morally accept the other form of liberalism, the pirate principle of free trade with its every man for himself philosophy. They simply have never grasped the connection between the abstract notion of the autonomous self and the practical application of this notion in the offices of the large industrial and commercial firms. Therefore, German stock market liberalism has hitched the German professor to its own wagon. It has sent him to the political meetings to talk and to be talked to. It has put him in the editor's chair, where with philosophical acumen he has turned out article after profound article, conveying to a gullible public, for whom the newspaper has long since replaced the Bible as a source of truth, political opinions that were commercially desirable to maintain. It has sent him to the Legislative Assembly to say aye and nay, thereby assuring for commercial interests, which never cared anyway for theories and constitutions, the creation of more and more opportunities for bribery and piracy. This English-German liberalism now exerts a business-like control over practically all the important German newspapers, the entire educated class, and the Liberal Party. But the professors are not aware of this. In England, the liberal is a liberal through and through. He is ethically free, and for this reason also economically free, and is quite conscious of this connection. The German liberal has two discrete personalities, the ethical and the commercial. The one personality thinks, the other acts and controls. Only the latter personality is aware of the mutual relationship and finds it amusing. Thus we find two great economic principles opposed to each other in the modern world. The Viking has become a free tradesman. The Teutonic Knight is now an administrative official. There can be no reconciliation. Each of these principles is proclaimed by a German people, Faustian men par excellence. Neither can accept a restriction of its will, and neither can be satisfied until the whole world has succumbed to its particular idea. This being the case, war will be waged until one side gains final victory. And we still see this playing out today with the economic capitalist liberal countries still trying to take down what they call totalitarian societies that exist today. Is world economy to be worldwide exploitation or worldwide organization? Are the Caesars of the coming empire to be billionaires or universal administrators? Shall the population of the earth, so long as this empire of Faustian civilization holds together, be subjected to cartels and trusts, or to men such as those envisioned in the closing pages of Goethe's Faust, Part 2? Truly, the destiny of the world is at stake. Now, I'm not quite sure of what he is exactly referencing here as far as what part in the Faust, but it could be towards the end. There's a war where people rise up against the king, and it says, Mephistopheles goes on and says, "At last the best got tired of all the madness. Men of ability rebelled and said, 'Let him be ruler who will establish order. The emperor can't and won't. So let's hold an election and have a new one. Give our land new life and guarantee each subject's safety. Thus, in a world that starts afresh, we shall let righteousness and peace be wed.'" So I'm not for sure, but I think that's what he is referencing. All right, we go on. Only three generally Faustian peoples possess the inner drive to create an economic system for the whole world. The knightly Spaniards made an attempt when they incorporated the New World into their empire. As true soldiers, they refrained from theorizing about their economic expansion, but by broadening geographical and political horizons, they prepared the way for a new kind of economic thought. The first country to formulate a theory about its economic activity was England, which created the notion of political economics to explain its own practice of universal exploitation. As businessmen, the English were clever enough to realize the power of the written word over the most book-conscious nation of all time, and they persuaded their nation that the interests of its pirates were those of the entire world. They succeeded in combining the notion of freedom with that of free trade. The third and last of these Faustian people, like the Spanish, a true military nation, lacked the practical shrewdness of the English. Prussia's accomplishment within its own economic sphere received in theory with the aid of the otherworldly German philosophy of idealism. the exalted title of socialism. But the true creators of Prussian economic life were not able to recognize their creations in this theoretical guise. Thus, there arose a bitter conflict between two unnecessarily hostile factions, one made up of theorists and another in charge of practice. We have now reached a stage where it is imperative for each of the sides to come to terms with the other and accept the task that faces both. Shall the world be ruled by capitalists or by socialists? This question cannot be decided by two countries in competition. It has become an internal question for each and every country. As today, as the weapons used against foreign states are put aside, they will be raised again in civil war. Today, in every country, there is an English and a Prussian economic party. And I would argue, if you're looking under the dialects he is setting up here, third position is a Prussian economic party, is a Knights Templar as opposed to the roaming Viking type party, using Spengler's definitions, of course. And when the classes and factions are tired of warfare, individual master types will keep it up in the name of principle. Amid the great conflicts of the classical age between the Apollonian and Dionysian principles, the Peloponnesian War developed out of a war between Athens and Sparta into a contest between oligarchies and demos in all cities. The decisions reached at the battles of Philippi and Actium had to be fought over again in the time of the Gracchi, filling the Roman Forum with blood. In the Chinese world, with the corresponding war between the Xian and Zhou empires, between the philosophies of the Tao and Li. In Egypt, great mysteries of the same kind are concealed beneath the mystery of the Hyksos period and the hegemony of the Eastern barbarians. Were they summoned, or did they come because the Egyptians had been desperately exhausted by civil strife? Will the Western world assign the same role to the Russians? Our trivial peacemongers can have their talk about reconciliation among nations. They will never reconcile ideas. The Viking spirit and the spirit of the knights will fight it out to the finish, i.e. capitalism and socialism. Even though the world may emerge weary and broken from the bloodbath of this century. This brings us to the political aspects of the English-Prussian antithesis. Politics is the highest and most powerful dimension of all historical existence. World history is the history of states. The history of states is the history of wars. Ideas, when they pass for decisions, assume the form of political units, countries, peoples, or parties. They must be fought over not with words, but with weapons. Economic warfare becomes military warfare between countries or within countries. Religious associations such as Jewry and Islam, Huguenots and Mormons constitute themselves as countries when it becomes a matter of their continued existence or their success. Everything that proceeds from the innermost soul to become flesh or fleshly creation demands a sacrifice of flesh in return. Ideas that have become blood demand blood. War is the eternal pattern of the higher human existence, and countries exist for war's sake. They are signs of readiness for war. And even if a tired and blood-drained humanity desired to do away with war, like the citizens of the classical world during its final centuries, like the Indians and Chinese of today, it would merely exchange its role of war rager for that of the object about and with which others would wage war. Even if a Faustian universal harmony could be attained, masterful types on the order of late Roman, late Chinese, or late Egyptian Caesars would battle each other for this empire, for the possession of it. If its final form were capitalistic, or if the highest rank in it, if it should become socialistic. The idea that parties, above all English parties, are segments of the people at large is dilettantish nonsense. In reality, there can be no such thing as a popular government or government by the people, except in political units comprising a few villages. Only hopelessly liberal Germans still cling to this notion. In all places where English political systems have penetrated, the government actually lies in the hands of a very few men who, with dictatorial arbitrariness, exert their power within the party on the basis of their experience, their superior will, and their tactical skill. Question therefore arises concerning the relationship between people and party. What meaning can elections have in the modern Western nations? Who does the electing? And whom or what does he elect? The sense of the English system is that the people elect a party, and not just a representative of its will and opinions, for these are more or less influenced by the party leadership in any case. The parties are very old and firmly established institutions, whose business it is to conduct the political affairs of the entire English nation. The individual Englishman realizes the practicality of such an institution, and from election to election he supports the party whose declared intentions correspond most closely to his own opinions and interests. He also realizes the unimportance of the individual representative appointed quite arbitrarily by the party. Indeed, the phrase fatuous electorate, fatuous meaning silly and pointless, fits the average representative better than the voting mass itself. It is significant that the English workers have quite often voted for an employer nominated by one of the age-old parties rather than for a workman candidate. In each case, after sober appraisal of the situation, they have regarded it as more advantageous to vote in this way. In America, where the genuine Englishman no longer stands behind the system, the custom now is for the parties to deliver one set of promises to keep the people and another to the trust that fills the party coffers. The first set is published, the second is kept. That democracy and universal suffrage are reliable tools of capitalism has been proved in all countries that have adopted these methods on the English model. While the liberal professor hails the Constitution of Weimar as a fulfillment of his dreams, the capitalist liberal welcomes it as the simplest and probably cheapest way to subject politics to the business office and the state to the grafters. In Prussia, however, there existed a true state, in the most exacting sense of the word. In Prussia, there were, strictly speaking, no private individuals. Every single person who lived in this system, which functioned with the precision of a good machine, was an integral member of that system. For this reason, the task of administration could not be assigned to private individuals as the parliamentary system prescribes. Administration of public funds was an official function, and the politicians responsible for it were state officials, servants of the Commonwealth. In England, business and politics were synonymous. In France, the swarm of professional politicians called into office by the Constitution had become hirelings of the business interest. In Prussia, the purely professional politician has always been a disreputable figure. Socialist monarchy, that is an idea that has slowly matured in the Faustian world and has long since reared its proper human protagonists. Authoritative socialism is by definition monarchistic. The most responsible position in this gigantic organism is, in Frederick the Great's words, the role of first servant of the state, must not be abandoned to ambitious privateers. Let us envision a unified nation in which everyone is assigned his place according to his socialistic rank, his talent for voluntary self-discipline based on inner conviction, his organizational abilities, his work potential, consciousness and energy, his intelligent willingness to serve the common cause. Let us plan for general work conscription, resulting in occupational guilds that will administrate and at the same time be guided by administrative council and not by a parliament. A fitting name for this administrative body in a state where everyone has a job, be it an army officer, a civil servant, a farmer, miner, might well be labor council. This is where Marx comes in. By means of a brilliant intellectual calculation, more overwhelming than correct, he tried to elevate facts to the rank of an idea. Across the powerful antithesis between Viking and knightly principles, he stretched out a thin but cohesive theory, thereby inventing a popular view of history that is in fact widely accepted in the present day. He was born in the Prussian atmosphere and later entered the atmosphere of England, but he remained a foreigner to the spiritual life of both peoples. As a citizen of the scientific 19th century, he was a good materialist but a bad psychologist, and therefore he failed ultimately to impart the quality of an idea to the great realities. Instead, he reduced ideas to concepts and single interests. Instead of the English blood, which he did not feel within himself, he espied only English things and concepts. And of Hegel, who by large and large presented Prussianism at its best, the only thing accessible to Marx was the method. Thus it happened that, by means of a truly grotesque calculation, he transformed the instinctual dichotomy between the two Germanic races into the material dichotomy between the two class levels. To the proletariat, the fourth estate, he ascribed the Prussian idea of socialism, while to the bourgeoisie, the third estate, he assigned the English idea of capitalism. These are the false equations that have given rise to the four concepts whose concrete meaning everyone is familiar with today. From his reinterpretation of racial strife as the strife between classes, and of ancient Germanic instincts as very recent impulses of large city populations, Marx derived his central concept of class conflict. The horizontal structuring of historical forces was made vertical. That is the meaning of the materialist view of history. The scientific mentality of the time required that matter and energy be regarded as opposites. The matter of the political energy was the peoples and nations. That of economic energy was the classes. Marxism reversed the importance of these two energies, and thus also of the two matters, and the word class thereby took on a completely new meaning. With the psychological naivete of a scientifically trained mind of 1850, Marx failed to comprehend the difference between class and estate. An estate is an ethical concept, the expression of an idea. The privileged segment of society in 1789 was distinguished from the bourgeoisie, and the state embodying of a formal ideal of grandeur, courtesy, and inward and outward nobility, no matter how much had been eroded by decadent living. It was only after the bourgeoisie had contested the ethical superiority of the older aristocratic modes of behavior that it made an issue of social privileges. Class, on the other hand, is a purely economic concept, and in 1850 it took the place of the ethical and political concept of the bourgeoisie of 1789. The ideal of the estates became class interest. It was only in England that the classes had long since been stratified according to wealth. The middle class was comprised of those who lived by their work without actually being poor. The upper class was rich without working. The lower class worked and was poor. In Prussia, however, it was rank, i.e., a greater or lesser degree of command and obedience that separated the classes. Besides the peasantry, there existed a civil servant class. That is to say, there was a unity of function rather than economic distinctions. By way of contrast, modern France is distinguished by the absence of real classes. The French nation is a disordered mass in which one can discern rich individuals and poor individuals, yet classes as such have not emerged. The entire nation is one class, not as rigorously stratified as the Germanic nations, but nonetheless single and unified. Marx was thus an exclusively English thinker. His two-class system derives from the situation of the mercantile people that sacrificed its agriculture to big business, and that never had possessed a national core of civil servants with a pronounced, i.e. Prussian, estate consciousness. In England there were only bourgeoisie and proletarians, active and passive agents in business affairs, robbers and robbed, the whole system very Viking-like. Transformed to the realm of the Prussian political ideals, these concepts make no sense. Marx would never have been able to distinguish English industrial slavery from the principle that emerges from the all-for-all idea, whereby every individual is a servant of the total state, regardless of rank or position. He took a wholly external image of Prussianism, organization, discipline, cooperation, all things that are independent of any single class, a technical pattern, socialism, and handed it over to the laborers in the society of the English type as a weapon and a goal, exhorting them to be good Vikings and switch the roles of robbers and robbed to expropriate the expropriators. And he wrapped it all up in an egotistic program that he called for the sharing of the spoils after the victory. Marxian morality is likewise of English origin. Marxism reveals in every sentence that the thought proceeds from which it sprang were theological and not political. Its economic theory is the outgrowth of the fundamental moral attitude, and the materialistic view of history is simply the final chapter of a philosophy with roots in the English Revolution, whose biblical moods have remained dominant in English thought. This is why Marx's basic concepts are felt to be moral alternatives. The words socialism and capitalism are terms for the good and evil of the irreligious religion. The bourgeoisie is the devil, the wage earner is the angel of the new mythology. And one need only sample the vulgar paths of the Communist Manifesto to recognize behind the literary mask the Christianity of the independents. Social evolution is the will of God. The final goal in an earlier age was eternal salvation. The collapse of the bourgeoisie civilization used to be called the Last Judgment. Marx succeeded in preaching contempt for work. Perhaps he did not realize this himself. Work, long, hard, tiring work, is for him a misfortune, an effortless gain, a blessing. Behind the typically English disdain for the man who lives by the sweat of his brow, we can find the instinct of the Viking, whose vocation is piracy and not patching sails. For this reason, the manual labor is more a slave in England than anywhere else. And his slavery is moral. He feels that his profession precludes his bearing the title of gentleman. The concepts of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat reflect the typically English preference for business rather than manual work. The former is a blessing, the latter a calamity. The one is noble, the other base. But with their hatred, the misfortunate ones say, business is the evil occupation, manual labor the good. But of course not over mental work. Just as the English intellectual was by choice either a Tory or a Whig, he had to choose between the two economic parties. Being a gentleman, he has naturally opted for big business. This is the explanation for the mental attitude which gave rise to Marx's social criticism and which has made him so catastrophic for true socialism. He knew the nature of work only from the English viewpoint, as a means of getting rich, as a means lacking in all moral depth. Only success and money, the visible and tangible signs of God's grace, were of ethical import. The Englishman has no inkling of the dignity of hard work. For him, work is a debasing thing, an ugly necessity. Pity the poor soul who has nothing but work, who owns nothing without more and more work, but who above all will never have wealth in the future. Had Marx understood the meaning of Prussian work, of activity for its own sake, the service in the name of the totality, for all together and not for oneself, duty that ennobles, regardless of the kind of work performed. Had he been able to comprehend these things, his manifesto would probably never have been written. On the matter, he was aided by his Jewish instinct, which he himself characterized in his essay on the Jewish question. The curse of physical labor pronounced in the beginning of Genesis, the prohibition against defiling the Sabbath by work. These things made him receptive to the Old Testament pathos of the English sensibility, his hatred of those who do not need to work. The socialism of Fichte would accuse such people of sloth. It would brand them as irresponsible, dispensable shrinkers and parasites. But Marxian instinct envies them.
They are too well off, and therefore they should be revolted against. Marx has inculcated his proletariat with a contempt for work. His fanatical disciplines wish to destroy all culture in order to decrease the amount of indispensable work. Martin Luther praised the simplest manual activity as pleasing to God. Goethe wrote of the demands of the day. Yet Marx dreamed of the proletarian Phaeton who would own everything without any effort.
That is, after all, the meaning of the expropriation of the blessed. And as far as English instinct is concerned, he was right. What an Englishman calls bliss, business success that saves physical work and makes one a gentleman, is good for all Englishmen. For us, it is obscene. It smacks of mobs and snobs. Marx became an Englishman on one other score as well. In his mind, the state does not exist. He thought statelessly in terms of society. Like parliamentary practice in England, his economic world functions as a two-party system with nothing above the parties. Within his scheme, there can be only combat and no arbitration, only defeat or victory, only the dictatorship of one of the two parties. The Communist Manifesto calls for a dictatorship of the good proletarian party over the evil capitalist party. Marx saw no alternatives. The Prussian socialist state exists between this good and evil. It is the whole people, and in the face of its absolute authority, the two Marxian parties are simply parties, minorities that serve the general weal. From a strictly technical viewpoint, socialism is a principle of public service. In the final analysis, every worker has the status not of businessman, but of public servant, as does every employer. There are public servants of industry, commerce, traffic, and the military. This system was realized in the grandest style in Egyptian culture, and again, though quite differently, in China. It represents the inner form of Western political civilization, and it already became manifest in the Gothic cities with their professional guilds and corporations. Pointing out the big difference between true socialism and Marxism is what Spengler is doing here, as far as socialism is a sense of duty, and Marxism is built around jealousy and contempt for desiring more materialism. So, two completely different mentalities. And thus why no functioning communist state has ever been Marxian. A symbolic expression of the system was the Gothic cathedral, in which every element was a necessary part of the dynamic whole. Marx was unable to comprehend this. His imagination and creative talent extended only so far as to convert a society of private businessmen into a society of private workers. As a critic, he was first-rate. As a creator, he was impotent. And I think that's what attracts people to Marxism, is the critiques of capitalism. But don't worry, there is a third position for those who really want to critique capitalism, but build something truly grand. This is provided by his constant retreat from the question of how he imagined the form of government would take in his gigantic universal mechanism, and by his dilettantish praise of the partisan council system of 1871, which originated under extraordinary conditions of a besieged city, but was powerless anyways. One cannot learn how to create by reading Marx. Either one is creative or one is not. The social democracy of the 19th century produced but one grand style creative personality, a politician who didn't write but who knew how to govern. August Bebel, who was a German advocate for socialism, chairman of the Social Democratic Party during the mid to late 1800s. He was definitely not the most intellectual member of his party, but he was its one and only organizer. A true ruler needs talents other than intellect in the literary sense. Napoleon did not tolerate any book writers in his entourage. The economic Darwinism of the Englishman, together with the Marxian two-class system, led to the adoption of the natural weapon to be used in a war between the real merchants and the merchandising laborers, the strike. By means of the strike, the commodity work is withheld from the buyer. By means of the opponent's strike, the lockout, the commodity money is withheld from the buyer. A reserve army of workers secures the market for the buyers of money, while a reserve army of employers, labor shortage, does the same for the buyers of work. The strike is the most unsocialistic aspect of Marxism. It is a classical sign of its origin in the businessman's philosophy that Marx adhered to by instinct and habit. In the true state, work is not a commodity but a duty towards the common interest. And there is no graduation. This is Prussian-style democratization of ethical values among the various kinds of work. The judge and the scholar perform work just as the miner and the lathe operator. In our German Revolution, it was English thinking that planned for the worker to expropriate the rest of the people by squeezing as much money as possible out of the least amount of work and by lauding his commodity above all others. One of the preconditions of a strike is that the people exist only as parties, not a state. Another Marxist, that is to say English, idea is the open negotiation for wage increases and the unilateral determination of wage scales following success of the proletarian party. The Prussian way of doing things is for the state to determine wages, impartially, for each kind of work, planning the scales carefully according to the total economic situation at any given time, in the interest of all the people, and not of any one profession. That is the principle of salary scales for civil servants, made to apply to all occupations. It includes a prohibition of the strike, for it regards this as a private commercial device, inimical to state interests. The power to set wage scales is removed from both employer and employee, and becomes a privilege of a general economic council, thus ensuring that each party will operate within the same firm boundaries as they have had to in other areas of management and work practice. And this is much how the Italian fascists dealt with strike and everything else. There was labor courts where the employer and the employee would go in front of the state and settle disputes instead of strikes. The state, just like what Spengler is defining here as like the Prussian attitude, the true socialist attitude, the state would define the wages, therefore taking the power out of the hand and thus the disunity away from the employer and employee. All things for the state and all things through the state. We now know what is at stake, not just German destiny, but the destiny of all civilization. The critical question not only for Germany, but for all of the world, but it must be answered for all the world and Germany, is this: in the future, shall business rule the state, or the state rule business? And today, obviously, business rules the state. As far as this momentous question is concerned, Prussianism and socialism are one and the same. Up to now, we have not realized this, and even today, it is not yet clear. The teaching of Marx, together with class egoism, are guilty of causing both the socialist labor force and the conservative element to misunderstand each other, and thus also to misunderstand socialism, where we are at today. But now it is unmistakable that they both have identical goals. Prussianism and socialism stand together in opposition to our inner England, against a set of attitudes that has crippled and spiritually debilitated our entire people. The danger is very great. Woe to those who hold back at this hour because of selfishness or ignorance. They will ruin others and themselves. Solidarity will mean the fulfillment of the Hohenzollern idea and at the same time the redemption of labor. Hohenzollern, it's the dynasty that stemmed the Frederick family or the Wilhelm family and many other princes and royalty throughout Prussia. The Hohenzollern idea at the same time, the redemption of labor. There is salvation either for conservatives and workers together or for neither.
Labor must rid itself of its Marxist illusions. Marx is dead. As a form of existence, socialism is just beginning. As a special movement within the German proletariat, socialism is finished. For the worker, there is either Prussian socialism or nothing. The meaning of socialism is that life is dominated not by the contrast of rich and poor, but by rank as determined by achievement and ability. That is our kind of freedom. Freedom from the economic capriciousness of the individual. My fervent hope is that no one will remain hidden who was born with the ability to command, and that no one is given the responsibility for commanding who lacks the inborn talent for doing so. Socialism means ability, not desire. Not the quality of intentions, but the quality of accomplishments is decisive. I turn to our youth. I call upon all who have marrow in their bones and blood in their veins. Train yourselves. Become men. We need no more ideologists, no more chatter about Bildung and cosmopolitanism and Germany's intellectual mission. We need hardness. We need courageous skepticism. We need a class of socialistic master types. Once again, socialism means power. Power and more power. Thoughts and schemes are nothing without power. The path to power has already been mapped. The valuable elements of German labor, in union with the best representatives of the old Prussian state idea, both groups determined to build a strictly socialist state, to democratize our nation in the Prussian manner. Both forged in a unit by the same sense of duty, by the awareness of a great obligation, by the will to obey in order to rule, to die in order to win, by the strength to make immense sacrifices in order to accomplish what we were born for, what we are, what could not be without us. We are socialists. Let us hope that it will not have been in vain. What a powerful way to end that essay. So yes, actual socialism is about being a contributing member of the community, not an intellectual that sniffs their own farts and offers nothing outside of criticism. Actual socialism is earning your spot through merit, not social privileges because of what you were born, be it rich, black, gay, or any other identity politic. In actual socialism, the state gives back to those who work, not welfare handouts to those who don't. Actual socialism strengthens the unity of the people, not seeking ways to keep the people divided. Actual socialism leads to tangible and communal growth and advancement, not mindless consumerism. Actual socialism is a friend to the working class, not to the bourgeois college kids or the inner city hooligans who today cry the name of socialism while they really mean Marxism. So death to capitalism, death to Marxism, long live the third position.